Despite winning a landslide victory a little over a year ago, the Labor government in the UK is already in deep polling trouble, with plenty of speculation over the leadership of Prime Minister Keir Starmer. And at the same time, the polling for far-right party Reform UK and its leader Nigel Farage has rocketed up. So in this Squiz Shortcut, we'll take a look at what's behind Starmer's fall and Farage's rise and what might happen next. Squiz Shortcuts is the backstory to the big news stories. I'm Andrew Williams.
And I'm Claire Kimball.
Claire, the electoral victory of Sir Keir Starmer and the Labor Party last year was a major news moment across the world. There was 14 years of Conservative Prime Ministers in the UK before that, and then Labor, which is on the centre-left side of politics, had their first UK Prime Minister since Gordon Brown in 2010.
A really big moment in British politics, and the scale of the victory was really quite notable as well. There are 650 seats in the UK lower house. Labor won 411 of them, and with a victory like that, you might expect that Labor would be set up for quite a chunk of time.
Yeah, it's a lot of seats to lose, so you think they'd be in a good position. But there's a few things worth noting about this victory, and this is where we get into a few voting stats, Claire. So first of all, and this is something that we'll come back to later in the episode, the UK has a different political system or a different voting system to Australia. So it uses something called first past the post voting instead of preferential voting. And Claire, I'm throwing this over to you to explain the difference between those two.
Look, it's just about how much of the vote you need, essentially. In Australia, a candidate, you need 50% to win. To do that, preferences come into play. So you remember when you go and vote, number one, in the federal election anyway, one exhausting all the way through the list. We rank our candidates rather than just pick our favourite. So if no one gets 50% the first time, then you go to the next one and you knock a candidate out. Who did their preferences go to? And when someone eventually tips over that 50% mark, that's the winner.
That's the winner and they get the seat. But the system in the UK is different. First past the post is where voters only select one candidate. So they just put a tick next to the one they like and that's it. And then whoever gets the most votes wins. You don't need 50% to get your seat. So this has a couple of impacts. First of all, it makes it tough for third parties to play a role in government because they need to win a very high percentage of the vote, higher than they would normally get, in a lot of seats spread out across the country, 650, as we said, in the UK. We'll come back to that idea a little bit later because it will be important. But for an established party like Labor, a major party, it can win a lot of seats in the House of Commons where the government is decided without winning a huge amount of the vote. It just has to get more than anybody else.
It's kind of like if you look at Australia, it's what our primary vote would be.
Yes.
Whoever wins the primary vote would win that seat.
Exactly.
It's exactly what happened last year, that scenario that you were talking about. In fact, Labor won 33.7% of the vote, the lowest when it comes to the electoral vote of a government since 1830.
Yeah.
So, and still a landslide, a huge chunk of that lower house of the British Parliament. When records started, of course, back in 1830, to get the lowest primary vote or the lowest vote is really quite something. So the amount of seats, huge. The amount of votes, not so much.
Exactly right. And so that means while Starmer and Labor's victory was very broad, it was also shallow. And that means that if their first year went badly, it could spell trouble for Starmer's leadership and the party's chances at the next election. And that is exactly what happened.
I feel smarter already. Like, it's a really good explainer as to why there's so much pressure on Keir Starmer, even though he had all of those seats that they won, like from the outside, a huge electoral victory. So why is he in so much trouble?
Exactly.
And look, to that point, the recent polling shows that Starmer is one of the most unpopular prime ministers on record in the UK, depending on the poll. The amount of British people who disapprove of his performance is in the high 60s, low 70s.
Yeah.
It's a really big disapproval rate. It makes him not only unpopular on a record scale, but also one of the most unpopular leaders in Western democracy. So really only second to the French president, Emmanuel Macron, who's also deeply unpopular.
Yes, and he's had about 78 prime ministers in the last 6 years. So there's a lot of problems there in France as well. But as for where it went pear-shaped for Starmer and Labor, they faced problems on sort of both the left and right of their sort of political beliefs. So there was a recent promise to increase defence spending at around the same time as they also announced a decision to cut welfare payments. That did not go down well with people on the left. Then there was a decision to axe winter fuel payments for pensioners. That didn't really go down well with anybody. It sparked such a big backlash that the government had to reverse that decision almost a year later.
Yeah, the party might also need to back down on a promise that they made in that 2024 election not to increase taxes. They've had to deal with the resignations of some really key members of the government as well. 7 Labor MPs have left the party in the time since the party came to office in 2024. That's all created a real sort of sense of chaos and loss of confidence in the government from the public and also in Starmer's leadership.
And one major reason that it does spell trouble for Starmer's leadership is because all of those MPs that he's now got, 411 of them, are all now looking at their small shares of the vote and their very thin majorities and staring down the barrel of losing their seats if the government's performance and its polling doesn't improve. And that means that members of his own party are getting very restless very quickly.
And the number of MPs needed to force some sort of leadership spill. This takes me back to my Boris Johnson, etc. days, just to get your head around how that party room works, that system in the UK. For Labor, only 20% of MPs need to be able to create a spill. That's about 80 MPs out of that 411. In comparison, in Australian Labor, it's 60%. There was a new threshold established in the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd days to make it a little bit harder to dump their leader. Of course, we had so much chaos between 2007, 2013 when the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government was in power. It's not good. So settling those party sort of, I guess, frameworks to make sure that there's a little bit more stability is something.
Yeah, so Labor in Australia learned that lesson, but 20% is not many in
not
UK
much of
Labor.
a threshold.
So that's just to force a spill. Actually, moving the leader altogether would take obviously much more of a majority, but just to get that spill going, only 20%, only 80 MPs, and there's plenty of them worried about their position. So you might be wondering, looking at this, well, hang on, where has all that support gone? Why has Labor's support disappeared? If people aren't going to vote for them anymore, who are they going to vote for? Now, one of the recipients of that sort of loss of support has been the Green Party in the UK. It's really picked up its polling to about 15%. But really, this is where a man called Nigel Farage and a party called Reform UK comes heavily into the picture. So we'll talk more about that next. If you've heard the name Nigel Farage before, it's most likely because he was one of the key voices behind the Brexit referendum in 2016, where there was an upset victory, as some analysts saw it, for the Leave campaign that he supported. We'll get to how he became a leading voice in that movement shortly, but first, a little bit of background on him and how he came to his position.
So born in 1964, which would make him early 60s, 61 or so. His father was a stockbroker. He originally went into trading as his career as well. As far as his political career goes, though, he was a member of the Tories, of the Conservative Party, but he switched to UKIP. That was the United Kingdom Independence Party, and it's on the right of the Conservatives. So he's definitely coming from that sort of vantage point of the political spectrum. That was in 1993. He was elected to the European Parliament in 1999.
And the fact that he was elected to the European Parliament is notable because his kind of core issue for much of his political career, particularly with UKIP, has been as a big sceptic of the UK's involvement and participation in the European Union. And that really did come to a head, as we mentioned, in 2016.
Yeah, that just to remind you, if it's gone out of your brain, you need to free up some space every now and then. Leave Brexit was all about the UK exiting the European Union. Yep. So 2016, to focus on that was the year of that Brexit referendum. It was the vote whether to stay or leave the EU. The Leave vote, which was Farage's side, won that referendum. As you say, it was quite a shock. It led the United Kingdom into a process of leaving the EU. It lasted about 4 years. It was quite torturous.
It was agonising.
Getting some sort of agreement because, of course, it touched so many parts of everyone's lives, whether it was trade, whether it was movement of people, all sorts of things like the flow of goods. Remember, there was supply chains that were sort of really, really stuck for a while there because the movement of goods was a whole thing. Regardless of that, it was a huge political victory for that side of politics, for Farage in particular, and it essentially cost then David Cameron, the Prime Minister, his job. He resigned as a result. A few years after that, Farage formed this new party. It was the Brexit Party, and to try and capitalise on that success, it was quite a movement at the time. That party was really influential, of course, in terms of Brexit. But because of that electoral problem that we mentioned earlier of third parties other than the Labor Party and the Tories, the Conservatives finding it hard to win seats, it seemed unlikely that they were going to make much of an impact when it came to the British Parliament.
And that was one of the reasons that Farage originally left politics in 2021. By that point, the Brexit Party had become the Reform UK Party, which is how we refer to it from this point forward. He stayed on in an honorary role, but he basically said he could do just as much to influence policy through his media roles rather than having to worry about party politics. So he became a talk show host on the conservative news network GB News. He also competed in a season of the reality TV show I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, where they go into the jungle and they eat witchetty grubs and things like that.
In the Australian bush as well.
In the Australian bush. He finished third in that.
Yep.
But soon after that, he did end up coming back as the official leader of Reform, and that really started Reform's rise in the polls.
Yeah, and Reform's platform now is broader than just that UK and the EU issue. It still has reducing immigration, one of the key platforms. If you want to get into that traditional sort of right of politics, immigration is definitely a big one. It's a big part of their platform. Firmly against net zero emissions by 2050. It wants to reduce government spending as well. And look, Reform UK is winning over voters. For Farage's part, he says that he's speaking to voters in a way that the establishment can't. He's more influencer, as you say, as a talk show host and someone who is really sort of injecting himself into the zeitgeist. Analysts say it's sort of like out of the Donald Trump playbook, the way he's approaching things. Yeah,
and if you're looking for an Australian analogue, One Nation is probably the close. Like if you're trying to place it in your political spectrum in your head, One Nation is probably the closest thing to Reform UK that we have in Australia. One Nation's polls have been shooting up recently in Australia, and in a recent Ipsos poll in the UK, Reform actually won 33% of the vote. That was the highest by some margin, well above Labor, who was in government, 18%, and the Conservative Party's 16%. And that means that problem that we talked about, where a third party has traditionally faced the idea of not being a chance to win enough seats in government due to falling short of the main parties, is at the moment, at least, not that much of a problem. If an election was held now, Reform UK would be a chance to form government, which raises another question in all this, Claire. What has the Conservative Party been doing while all this has been going on? How have they been going?
Well, of course, they were decimated in the election, and it's kind of like a similar discussion to the coalition here. Like they have to rebuild. Who are they? What do they stand for? So, of course, the Tories, the Conservative Party, they were in government for 14 years. They had a couple of disastrous final years, short-lived prime ministers. Of course, we had Liz Truss, who, remember, was up against a lettuce in terms of her longevity as the leader. Rishi Sunak was then the one who took them to the election and lost. They're now led by Kemi Badenoch, who has really struggled to lift, you can tell by those poll results, struggled to lift the party's appeal. In that same poll that you just mentioned, she had a higher approval rating than Starmer, but only just. And as we said, Starmer's very unpopular. So the other major party in the UK is suffering as well when you look at the grand scheme of things, this sort of avenue that has opened up for Reform UK to be a big player in this. And as you said, the first past the post system means that they could be a real contender for some serious seats.
Absolutely right. And so as for what happens next, so the deadline for the next election, and this is where this is an interesting question, is August 2029, because the UK has 5-year term limit. So it's quite a long way away, and that would be quite a long time for a party like Reform to keep up its momentum. But the Prime Minister, if they should so choose, can call an election much earlier than that, similar to how it works in Australia. Of course, Reform could lift its polling numbers even higher. There's nothing stopping that. But the most pressing question right now is, will Prime Minister Keir Starmer actually hold on to his leadership?
There's a bunch of potential challenges that have been widely discussed, everyone from Wes Streeting, who's a Conservative centrist, also the Health Minister. Another contender is the Mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham. Doesn't have a seat in Parliament as it stands, but seems to be a bit of a shining light for the party. For all those challenges, though, both of those candidates might face the same problems as Starmer has been facing. And there's such a long deadline to the next election. There's a lot to play out. Yeah, this is all about timing at this point. So as far as that goes, one of the key dates in the analysis that I've read to look out for is May 2026. So that's when there's a series of local government elections in the UK, and people who know their UK politics
tend to look at those as a good example of how a national election might play out. So if the government has...
Like, just to interject, of course, they don't have state governments there.
No.
They've just got the federal and the local councils.
Yes.
So it's kind of the counterpart.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's the closest we would find to a state government, giving an idea of how that particular region is feeling. And if the government hasn't recovered by then and has another series of poor results, that's when the pressure on Starmer might be even more intense, because those local results are, as I said, a good guide on how they might go nationally. But that is if Starmer is even still Prime Minister at this point, which is far from a given. And then if Farage's rise keeps going, then Reform UK are in the box seat and it might be time for an election.
I've never been so invested in some local government elections before in my life.
Yeah, getting you invested in local government elections in the UK, that's what we do at the Squiz. And that's our shortcut to the rise of Nigel Farage. Each week, we like to give Squizz's recommendations for further info on the topic. Claire, I'm going to recommend a video from TLDR News. If you haven't heard of them, they're quite Squiz-esque. They do short form explainers on British politics, most particularly. Video news channel in the UK, and it explains why young people in particular have left the Labor Party. They are increasingly turning their support towards both reform, as we said, and also, as I mentioned, the Green Party in the UK as well. So they go into what's behind that.
As you know, I love a bit of short form, good explainer news. We've also got a piece from The Conversation which really goes into the nuts and bolts of why Starmer is in so much trouble. If you want to really sort of drill down on that a little bit, it's a good one.
Yeah, get into the policy mistakes and errors that they've made. So I'll put links to those in the episode notes. Thank you for listening, and remember to share this episode with your mates who want to hear the backstory to the big news stories. Don't forget, if you've got an idea for a future Squiz shortcut, we love to hear them and we love to hear from you. Just flick it through to hello@thesquiz.com.au. Until next time.